darkmyths.org, Minneapolis Media Group, proudly present to you the Lone Gunman Podcast, featuring your host, Rob Clark, where research comes to shine and myths come to die. Stay tuned. Be right there.
What's up, everybody, and welcome to the show. This is episode number 162 of the Lone Gunman Podcast, and I'm your host, Rob Clark, here with you today. Today, we're going to be trying to make sense of the Tippit murder. Now, when I was in Dallas, I had the opportunity to actually go and visit the scene of the Tippit murder at 10th and Patton. And I'm glad I did, because it finally put everything into perspective. You know, it's been probably 4 years or so since I've even addressed the Tippit murder on this show. But it is a very important part of nailing Oswald to the proverbial cross when it comes to the Kennedy assassination. You know, well, he murdered the police officer JD Tippit, so he must have murdered John F. Kennedy. Well, that's not exactly the case. The most convoluted and controversial aspects of the Kennedy assassination, when you come to terms with exactly where all the witnesses were positioned and what they say that they saw, and seeing it in person, it makes it 100 times more clearer, and also 100 times more confusing when you see how close in proximity these witnesses were to the actual shooting of JD Tippit, but yet so many of them saw different things. Some people saw two men. Some people saw a short, stocky guy with curly hair. Some people saw Oswald. Some people saw a man resembling Oswald, but slightly different. There's just so many things that go into consideration when you're talking about this, including the time that Tippit was actually murdered. You know, part of the entire case against Oswald hinges on the assumption that he could have made it to 10th and Patton by 1:15 to allegedly murder Oswald. Now, several of the Tippit murder witnesses have placed the time much closer to 106, 107. And, of course, the Warren Commission tried to push that back as far as they could to allow for the time that it would have taken Oswald to allegedly walk from his rooming house to the location on 10th and Patton where Tippit was actually murdered. You know, they had to give him as much time as possible to get there, because according to Earlene Roberts, if you believe what she says, Oswald come frantically through the doorway at a little after 1 o'clock and obviously went to his room, changed clothes, and was putting on a jacket as he went back out the door, approximately 104 or 105. And, she went on to further state that she looked out her window and saw him standing on the corner as if he was waiting for a bus. So it wasn't like he went out the front door of the rooming house, if it was actually him staying there, and, just started walking. So every little thing adds to the problematic timeline of placing Oswald as the murderer of JD Tippit. Several recreations were done, walking that exact route. and most of them say that they could have made it in anywhere from 12 to 15 minutes. So the further you place Oswald at the rooming house, the less time you have for that to actually happen and take place. And it really makes no sense to me whatsoever, that as soon as Tippit would have driven up, that Oswald would have just immediately shot and killed him as soon as he got out of his car for seemingly no reason. Or else he would have done the same thing in the Texas theater. As soon as he saw a cop come in, he would have started shooting. That to me is logical. What isn't logical is this whole convoluted question of why. Like, where was Oswald going? Why was he walking in this direction? Why was he going where he was going? If the original plan was to go to the Texas theater, he more than likely would have just walked down Zang's and made a left on Jefferson. That would have been probably the most logical route. And if you look at a map of the area and the direction in which Oswald was actually walking in, it's very illuminating when you actually look at it. He was actually walking in the direction of Jack Ruby's apartment. Now, to me, this is indicative of something. I don't think the Texas theater was the intended end destination. I don't think Oswald was running out of the rooming house or hauling ass to catch a movie at the Texas theater, as soon as he got off work early. I just don't think that was the original plan. I do, however, think that something was going on here. And, of course, that all goes out the window if it was not actually Oswald staying at the rooming house, and that the person who came in the door and left the rooming house around 1 o'clock was not Oswald. Then everything goes out the window. So we know Oswald left the depository somewhere around 12:45. Kennedy was shot at 12:31. Let's say Oswald left at 12:40. He walked down Elm, down Houston, down Main, caught a bus, got caught in traffic, and then eventually walked up to the Greyhound bus station where he caught a cab and allegedly took a cab somewhere on Zang's. Because, of course, the cab driver didn't actually drop him off in front of the rooming house. He dropped him off, and I've heard, anywhere from 5 to 7 blocks past his rooming house, closer to where he used to live down, I think it was down near Elsbeth or Neely Street. And then Oswald supposedly walked back to the rooming house. Now, this is a big question of why was this done? What is going on here? Was this really Oswald, or was it somebody else that was mistaken for Oswald? This is what makes the whole thing convoluted. Now, according to the Dallas County of Texas official death certificate for JD Tippit, it states his time of death at 1:15 p.m. on November 22nd, 1963. The autopsy was finished at 3 p.m. by Earl Rose at Parkland, and it was signed by Judge Joe Brown Jr. Now, the official records of the Dudley Hughes Funeral Home, who came to collect Tippit's body after the shooting, reflect the following information. That he was pronounced dead at 1:25 p.m. at Methodist Hospital by Dr. Ligori. And then, of course, he was transferred to Parkland Hospital for the autopsy by Dr. Rose. Now, the distance from Oswald's rooming house to the actual murder scene is 0.85 miles. So it's not necessarily one whole mile. There's contention about this jacket that was supposedly Oswald's, that was found under a car at the Texaco station around the corner on Jefferson. Marina stated that she'd never seen the jacket. It had cleaning tags in it that were never identified. And Oswald was probably a little too frugal to have his jackets dry cleaned. He probably made Marina do it by hand. One of her biggest gripes was that she wanted a washing machine because there was so much laundry to do, of course, with 2 babies and diapers and a husband and her clothes. And that was one of the great things about America, is that you could have a washing machine, and that's one of the things she supposedly hounded Oswald for, and that he was saving up to get her. There's problems, of course, with the witnesses, as we've stated, and there's also problems with the ballistics when it comes to the Tippit killing. In the Warren report, it states that one bullet taken from Officer Tippit matches Oswald's .38 to the exclusion of all other weapons. That was their big definitive statement. But then they contradict themselves when they claim that the .38 had been rechambered for a .38 special cartridge. It had not been rebarreled for a .38 special bullet. Therefore, it was slightly oversized for a .38 special bullet, which has a smaller diameter than a .38 Smith & Wesson bullet. This would result in a .38 special bullet traveling through the barrel to be erratic, resulting in inconsistent microscopic markings. And then, of course, we have the problem with the magic bullets, is what I call them, the ones that mysteriously were found in Oswald's pocket after he'd been in custody for 4 or 5 hours, having markings on them that looks exactly like they would come out of stored in like a police belt, or a holster strap. They were indicative of markings. Where the leather abrasions, or the leather had created microscopic metallic abrasions on the surfaces of the bullets found in his pocket, as being consistent with those being stored in like a leather gun belt, like police wear. So it's very, very problematic, I guess you could say, for the Warren report, and even for the Dallas cops, because where did Oswald's gun, the pistol, actually come from? And how did these magic bullets get into his pocket? Because you see, no other ammunition was found at all for either the Carcano or the pistol at the rooming house or at Ruth Payne's. So where did the ammo come from for these weapons? Where did he practice? And if he didn't practice, then where's the other ammo? When you buy a box of ammo, you're going to have a lot of leftover bullets than what will fit in the gun. So what happens to all this stuff? Where did it go? Why didn't he have it if it was his gun? And, the typical gun for a Dallas police officer back then was a .38 Smith & Wesson. Let's see. Then we have some, I guess you could say, problems with Officer Tippit himself and his shortcomings. There was allegations that he was not faithful to his wife, which are apparent as in the Warren Commission. They interviewed Mrs. Johnny Maxie Witherspoon. She stated that she became acquainted with Officer Tippit during his employment at Austin's Barbecue. Mrs. Witherspoon informed the committee that she and Tippit engaged in a relationship and started dating for a couple of years. Okay, so, yeah. So, it's pretty clear that Tippit was cheating on his wife. And there was also allegations that he was involved in narcotics. Mr. Dulles, Alan Dulles, says, a rumor reached me that Officer Tippit had been in some way involved in narcotics trouble. I don't know what the foundation of that is. Do you know anything about it at all? Chief Curry says, nothing whatsoever. No, sir. You mean you know nothing about it, or you checked it out and there is no validity? Ford said. Curry said, this is the first I've ever heard that he was involved in any narcotics. So there's allegations of cheating on his wife, being involved in drugs, trafficking, because Tippit was a patrolman for a very, very long time with the Dallas Police Department. And normally someone who was with a department for that long would get a promotion at some point. So there had to be some kind of a reason why JD Tippit stayed a patrolman for 12 years. It just doesn't make sense. So that's another problem. Now, we've all heard the story of Tippit rushing into the Top 10 record store to make a frantic phone call a little after 1 o'clock. Now, people think that he may have been calling somebody, Jack Ruby, a different contact, or maybe there is another problem, because apparently, and I don't know this for sure, sorry, I'm trying to look and find my place here. Okay, Johnny Maxie Witherspoon, the lady that he was having an affair with, was living at a residence occupied by Ann McCraven on 10th Street. So apparently this information came from Virginia Davis and William Scoggins, that a problem may have arisen at that particular time for JD Tippit. You see, there was a baby born named Susan Marie Thompson. She was born on June the 17th of 1964, which could mean, or would mean, that she was conceived around the middle of September in 1963. Therefore, questions related to Johnny's pregnancy would have been coming up around the time of the assassination, meaning that she would have realized that she was pregnant, a month and a half later, when she didn't get her period, or then she had had a test, or however they did it back then in the early 60s. I don't know. But that could help explain the frantic phone call made by Tippit from the Top 10 record store and why he was out of his area and on 10th Street. Maybe he was going to visit or try to communicate with what's her name? Johnny Maxie Witherspoon. Because if he'd been having an affair with her for years and all of a sudden she got pregnant, that's kind of a problem, being that JD Tippit is married and has 3 children already. So that is a possible alternative explanation for the Top 10 record store and what Tippit was actually doing down on 10th Street. And if someone else had found out about this, you see, because apparently Johnny's husband had been, I don't know if he had been away or incarcerated or whatever, but apparently he had just returned home sometime that fall of 63. And if she had become pregnant by someone else, well then, certainly he's going to be a little upset about it, don't you think? So there's a lot of controversy and potential trouble brewing here for JD Tippit and his girlfriend. Now in 1967, September 19th, 1967, Bill Turner from Ramparts magazine fame tracked down former Dallas patrolman Harry Olsen in California and interviewed him. The reason why Olsen is of interest, is that he was actually a good friend of Jack Ruby. They spent approximately 3 hours with Jack Ruby the night of the assassination. Said he was very troubled. Don't know exactly what they talked about. I believe his wife or girlfriend was a dancer for Jack Ruby. He said he declared that Jack Ruby was a homosexual and Spectre had stricken it from the record. Olsen said he has been avoiding reporters because he does not want to get involved in the controversy. However, he is perfectly willing to assist this investigation, provided his name is kept out of it. I agreed to proceed on that stipulation. But we have the original transcript here, so we know who it is. The following is the relevant portion of a 1.5 hour session with Olsen. Olsen stated, in the summer of 1962, Jack Ruby left Dallas on a supposed trip to Havana via New Orleans to pick up an act. He was gone 2 weeks, returning without an act, and uncharacteristically silent regarding the trip. The only Cuban Olsen knew to be an associate of Ruby's was a young limbo dancer at the club, name not recalled. When asked if Ruby spoke Russian, Olsen said he had heard him speak some foreign language, but it could have been Yiddish. Asked if he heard the name Jim Braden around Ruby's club, Olsen said the name was very familiar, and he tended to associate it with a high roller from Houston, that Ruby was going to fix up with a girl. Olsen stated Ruby had many friends in Houston. He recalled particularly a man in the outdoor sign business who was always accompanied by a business associate or bodyguard and drove a white Cadillac. This man came by the carousel off and on for some 3 years, and at the end was in the process of selling the sign business. Olsen said he was in his late 20s or 30s. Olsen advised that a patrolman named Bill Swafford was a frequent visitor to the carousel. The most frequent visitor, he said, was Detective Sergeant Jerry Hill, the sergeant who found shell casings at the Tippit shooting scene and was at the Texas Theater, and before that was at the TSBD, to whom Ruby was always giving 6 packs of beer. Hill escorted FBI men to persons around the carousel locale and told the persons, "Tell the FBI what you know about Ruby." Olsen says that one of these persons cracked, "Why don't you? You know him best." It is noted that Hill was not questioned by the commission via his relationship concerning Ruby. Olsen did not know the nature of the relationship between Bertha Cheek and Ruby, but he did say that Cheek obtained many business leads from a man named O.L. Nelms, a shrewd entrepreneur who once bought and sold the Sanger Harris department store, making $100,000 on the deal. Olsen does not know Louis McWillie. He was only vaguely familiar with Officer Tippit. He does not know what motorcycle patrolman was particularly friendly with Ruby. I asked Olsen if he knew Ray Brantley. Yes, he said, and that is Brantley with Ray's gun shop. He was busted once for sale of an automatic carbine and was sentenced to 1.5 years. He feels Brantley would be in a lot of fast buck deals. I asked Olsen about the Abundant Life Temple in Oak Cliff. He did not know anything about it specifically, but said there could well have been more going on there than met the eye. He mentioned a private club on Zang's as a possible place the Tippit killer could have ducked into. This club can be entered through a rear door only, and it has an old mortuary sign in the front, and would be on the east side of Zang's. Olsen said that on the day of the assassination, he was guarding a ramshackle house in Oak Cliff, sitting inside. He said an attorney had hired him to guard the property of a recently deceased person. This is apparently where some think Olsen was lying when he said he was guarding an estate, in quotes. He heard the sirens but did not see anything himself. Olsen then stated he believed George Senator had been living with Ruby for better than a year, but he lived off base for a month or two at a time when Ruby would bring home some boyfriend to live with him. I displayed an assortment of photographs to Olsen. He picked Gordon Novell as possibly identical to a man he saw leaving Ruby's carousel one night. He could not be more specific. He picked Jim Hicks as possibly identical with a Jim Lee who owned a beer joint about a block from the carousel. He no longer owns it. The photograph of Edgar Eugene Bradley evoked a definite response. Olsen is certain he has seen him before, most likely around Ruby's. However, he could not associate a name or activities with the person in the photograph. Olsen said he had been ousted by Chief Jesse Curry because it came out that he had been hanging around Ruby's club and going with a Ruby stripper. Asked whether this meant the Dallas police wanted him off the force because this tainted the department or because he might know too much about events peripheral to the assassination, Olsen replied he didn't know for sure, but it could have been for both reasons. By the conclusion of the interview, Olsen expressed a desire to help us in any way possible. I had shown him photographs of Hall, Howard, and Seymour, and he thought that Lauren Hall looked familiar. He asked for copies of the photographs as well as the photograph of Bradley. I did give him copies of the Hall, Seymour, Howard photos. I would guess that he wanted to show them to his wife, former Ruby stripper Kathy Kay. It is of course possible that he would report back to the FBI or some other agency as to what we are up to, although I am inclined to doubt that this is the case. I gave Olsen my future address, or my address, and he said he will be in touch if he remembers or learns anything. He is not spontaneous in giving out information, and it has to be somewhat pried out of him. Recontact with him must be made through Al Burns as the Doctor's Business Bureau in Long Beach. So that, folks, is Harry Olsen. Now, I came across an arrest report from November 22nd, 1963 at 2:30 p.m. Okay? There was a man arrested named Daniel Wayne Douglas. He was arrested in the press room of City Hall at the Police and Courts building. And he was charged with burglary, auto theft, forgery, and murder. And this is the details of the arrest. This suspect was mingling with the officers involved in the investigation of the murder of Officer JD Tippit. He was observed in the hallway and among the officers for a period of 45 minutes. And upon questioning, he stated that he was at City Hall for the purpose of turning himself in for auto theft and burglary offenses that had taken place in Memphis, Tennessee, and Birmingham, Alabama. Lieutenant Baker of Robbery and Homicide Bureau was contacted and requested subject be held for investigation of murder. This subject also states that he has several checks and has been in the Dallas area for approximately 2 weeks and refused at the time of his arrest to give the location where he has been staying here in Dallas. The arresting officer was J.B. Drake and H.L. Henley. Never heard of that one before. That's very odd. Very odd. Huh. Interesting. Now, I also came across, this is going to be like, kind of a potpourri episode of weird stuff that I'd never heard of before. Of course, everybody's heard of Penn Jones Jr., publisher of the Midlothian Mirror, and in 1972, apparently Jones was taping a TV show in Chicago, and he was asked, if Oswald did not kill Officer Tippit, who did? Penn Jones Jr. states that he was thrown off by this question, and he says that, and we went blank. For the life of us, the name Larry Crawford would not come out. For the rest of that 30-minute show, we struggled unsuccessfully. Now we want to print his name for the world to see. It is the opinion of this editor, Larry Crawford was one of the 2 gunmen who shot Officer J.D. Tippit. Crawford fit the description given by most of the witnesses. Only 2 witnesses claimed the Tippit killer was Oswald. Crawford was missing for several hours that day. He was living at the Carousel Club and left Dallas 2 days later, the day before Ruby killed Oswald. Crawford's testimony is that of a trained agent. If the question was important, Crawford could remember nothing. If it was a trivial question, Crawford remembered every minute detail. The evidence points towards Crawford's escape after shooting Tippit by going into a church, but the police instead searched a branch library. Chicago, we are sorry we could not recall his name. Wherever you are, little punk Crawford, if you are still alive, come forward if you are not guilty. Okay. So that's Penn Jones Jr. calling out Larry Crawford. Now, I've made the assertion before on this show, on this very show, that I and others believe it is a very good possibility that the person that actually shot J.D. Tippit was Larry Crawford. Feel free to go back in the archives and find those episodes where I go much more in depth on Larry Crawford. Now, here's where things get interesting. And we go back to Ramparts magazine writer William Turner. In 1966, he reported in an article that on a recent trip to Dallas, he uncovered 5 witnesses to Tippit's whereabouts in the last minutes of his life. There is no indication that the commission or any police agency was even aware of them. Photographer Al Volklin and his wife Lou, both of whom knew Tippit, said that 15 or 20 minutes before the assassination, 15 or 20 minutes after the assassination, this would be about 12:45 or 12:50, they saw him at a gas station and waved to him. They observed Tippit sitting in his police car at a Gloco gas station in Oak Cliff, watching the cars coming over the Houston Street Viaduct from downtown Dallas. 3 employees of the Gloco station, Tom Mullins, Emmett Hollingshead, and J.B. Shorty Lewis, all of whom knew Tippit, confirmed the Volklin story. In 1987, Dallas area researcher Greg Lowry located 2 of the 5 witnesses just mentioned, and they verified the account that they had witnessed 24 years earlier, and there was no indication that any law enforcement agency had ever interviewed these 5 witnesses. This story was published in the Oak Cliff Tribune on June 30th, 1988. They said Tippit stayed at the station for about 10 minutes, and somewhere between 12:45 and 1 p.m., then he went tearing off down Lancaster at high speed on a beeline in the direction of Jack Ruby's apartment and in the direction of where he was killed a few minutes later. I hope this last statement about Ruby's apartment does not lead the reader to a sinister conclusion. In all fairness to the witnesses at the Glocko station that made the statement, I would like to mention again that Tippit was in the northernmost part of Oak Cliff. Tippit could only go south if he was to stay in Oak Cliff. It is true that traveling south on Lancaster is the general direction of Jack Ruby's apartment, but it is also the general direction of Tippit's patrol district, the Top 10 record shop, Tippit's home, and other Oak Cliff landmarks. This information has been provided by Tippit expert Greg Lowry by way of Bill Pulte. Greg recalled his interviews with Glocko station employees Emmett Hollingshead and J.B. Shorty Lewis. They were both certain that Tippit arrived at the Glocko station a few minutes after the shots were fired in Dealey Plaza. There was simply no doubt whatsoever about this. In their minds, they were absolutely certain. Bill Pulte informs me that these witnesses could have heard on the radio that shots were fired at the motorcade within minutes of the assassination, or motorists coming off the Houston Street Viaduct stopping for gas could have informed the Glocko employees about the shooting. The location of the former Glocko station is about 1.5 miles from the TSBD. So this throws another wrench in the whole official account of everything. When it comes to what JD Tippit was up to that afternoon and what exactly happened. So again, very odd behavior. Now going back to the testimony of Earlene Roberts, the plump widow who managed the rooming house where Oswald was living under the name, allegedly, O.H. Lee, Mr. Lee, excuse me, was one of the key witnesses for the Warren Commission. She testified that around 1 o'clock or maybe a little later, Oswald rushed into the rooming house, stayed in his room for 3 or 4 minutes, and walked out zipping a lightweight jacket. The last time she saw him, he was waiting at a nearby bus stop. A few minutes later, 1 mile away, Tippit was shot dead. Oswald was accused of the crime. Now, Mrs. Roberts testified also that during the brief time Oswald was in his room, a police car pulled up in front of the rooming house that she did not recognize either the car or the policeman. She heard the horn honk just kind of tit-tit twice, and after a moment she saw the police car move off down the street. Now, upon initial questioning, she thought that the number of the car was 107 or 106. Tippit's car was 10. So what does this mean? The police department issued a report saying all patrol cars in the area, except for Tippit's, were accounted for. The Warren Commission let it go at that. It did not seek to resolve the question, what were policemen doing honking the horn outside Oswald's rooming house 30 minutes after the presidential assassination. Their swift departure would indicate they certainly were not coming to apprehend him. It is perhaps too far-fetched to imagine they were giving Oswald some kind of signal. After testifying in Dallas in April of '64, Mrs. Roberts was subjected to intensive police harassment. They visited her all hours of the day and night, contacted her employers, and identified her as the Oswald rooming house lady. As a result, she was dismissed from 3 housekeeping jobs and nursing jobs in April, May, June of '64 alone. No telling how many jobs she lost after that. Relatives report right up until her death a year and a half later, Earlene complained of being hassled to death by the local Dallas police. Earlene Roberts died January 9th of '66 in Parkland Hospital. Police said she suffered a fatal heart attack in her home. No autopsy was performed. Which brings us to some mysterious deaths related to the Tippit witnesses. We've touched on some of these in some previous episodes, so I'm not going to go too in-depth on them. But one was Nancy Jane Mooney, a former dancer at the Carousel Club with alleged ties to Warren Reynolds' shooting suspect, Daryl Wayne Garner, who was shot in the head. Warren Reynolds, that is. Now, when Reynolds was, he was not questioned by any police agency until 2 months after the event. When the FBI finally talked to him on January 21st, 1964, the agents reported the interview said he would hesitate to definitely identify Oswald as the individual that he saw running from the scene. The FBI report added, however, in most unpoliceman-like fashion, he advised he is of the opinion Oswald is the person. 2 days after talking to the FBI, Reynolds was shot in the head. Later, after consulting at length with retired General Edwin Walker, he told Warren Commission counsel that Oswald definitely was the man he saw fleeing the Tippit murder scene. Yeah, I guess a shot in the head will change your mind. And imagine that, after talking to General Edwin Walker. Now, there was a house painter named Hank Killiam. Big fella, 6'3", 250. Big hunk of a man, said his wife Wanda, who used to push cigarettes and drink with the customers at Jack Ruby's club. Now, Hank and Wanda were good friends of John Carter, another painter who lived at A.C. Johnson's rooming house at the same time Lee Oswald lived there. John Carter worked several painting jobs with Hank and used to visit the Killian home all the time. To all appearances, his wife's 15-year association with Ruby and his friendship with John Carter, Oswald's fellow boarder, were Killiam's only tenuous links to the Kennedy assassination. A few hours after the event, he came home white as a sheet, Wanda said, and stayed up all night watching television accounts of the assassination. He bought all the papers and diligently clipped the stories about Kennedy's death. Just before Christmas, Killian packed up and left for Florida, where he had family, taking his assassination files with him. But the agents got to Wanda. They browbeat me into telling them where he was. I guess I'm just a girl that finds it very hard to say no to people, Wanda said. Hank eventually got a job in Tampa selling cars at his brother-in-law's lot. Again, the feds hounded him, visiting the car lot so often that even his brother-in-law was persuaded to let him go. They harassed his second Tampa employer as well, until he lost that job too. In mid-March, he called Wanda in Dallas to say he had a new job lined up and would be sending for her soon. I was all excited, said Wanda, because I love that man. Then in the early morning hours on St. Patrick's Day, 1964, Killian received a phone call at his mother's home. Immediately he left the house. Not long afterward, they found him on a sidewalk in front of a broken plate glass window with his jugular vein cut. He bled to death en route to the hospital. His wallet and diamond ring were missing. It is not clear whether the feds, in quotes, who visited Hank and Wanda were in fact FBI men, or whether they ever properly identified themselves as such. So yeah, that is a brutal way to go. Now, William Wally, he was the Oswald cabbie who claimed that, he had given Oswald a ride to the intersection of Beckley and Nietzsche's, which is half a block from the rooming house, and collected $1. Later, he identified Oswald as his fare in a questionable police lineup, although police records are confusing, and he may have actually picked out another man. Wally was killed in a head-on collision on a bridge over the Trinity River on December 18th, 1965. The 83-year-old driver of the other vehicle was also killed. Wally had been with the City Transportation Company since 1936 and had a perfect, no-accident record until the day he passed. He was the first Dallas cabbie to be killed on duty since 1937. When Penn Jones went to interview the general manager of the cab company about Wiley's death, he was literally pushed out of the office. "If you're smart," said the manager, "you won't be coming around here asking questions no more." Then we get to Tippit witness Domingo Benavides, who testified that he really got a good view of the slayer. He was not asked to see a police lineup in which Oswald appeared, though. Although he later said the killer resembled newspaper pictures of Oswald, he described the man differently. "I remember the back of his head seemed like his hairline sort of went square instead of tapered off. It kind of went down and squared off and made his head look flat in the back." Domingo reports that he has been repeatedly threatened by police and advised not to talk about what he saw. Sound familiar? In mid-February 1964, his brother Eddie, who looked just like him, was fatally shot in the back of the head in a beer joint on 2nd Avenue in Dallas. Police said it was a pistol shot, wrote up in a cursory report, and marked the case unsolved. Now, Domingo's father-in-law, J.W. Jackson, was so unimpressed with the police investigation of his brother Eddie's death that he launched a little inquiry of his own. 2 weeks later, Jackson was shot in his home. The assailant secreted himself in the carport, fired once into the house, and when Jackson ran outside, fired one more time, barely missing his head by a few inches. As the gunman clambered into an automobile in a nearby driveway, Jackson saw a police car coming down the block. The officer made no attempt to follow the gunman's car, instead stopped at Jackson's home and spent a long time inquiring what had happened. Later, a police lieutenant advised Jackson, "You better lay off this business. Don't go around asking questions. That's our job." Jackson and Domingo are both convinced that Eddie's murder was a case of mistaken identity and that Domingo, the Tippit witness, was the intended victim. So yeah, there's a whole lot of deaths. Well, I mean, if you want to include Dorothy Kilgallen, she was the first to make public the existence of Akilah Clemens, a witness to the Tippit killing whose name does not appear once in the Warren Report or volumes. She was also the only reporter to ever interview Jack Ruby privately since the killing of Oswald. During the Ruby trial, which she covered for the now-defunct New York Journal, Judge Joe Brown granted her 30 minutes alone with Ruby in the judge's chambers, and the other reporters were furious. She died in her bed on November 8, 1965, of acute barbiturate and alcohol intoxication. And a lot of people say that, that she had told her friends, "In 5 more days, I'm going to bust this case wide open." So yeah, a lot of mysterious deaths surrounding this whole Tippit deal. Now back to the Benavides for a minute. Shirley Martin, who was a first-generation researcher into all this from Hominy, Oklahoma, has been repeatedly tailed by police, Dallas police, is not the only independent investigator to have noticed unusual heat when checking out details of the Tippit killing. Earlier this year, Mark Lane located Domingo Benavides, a witness to the shooting whose brother was mysteriously killed. We just talked about that. And arranged to meet him at Lane's motel for a filmed interview the next morning. Lane had offered him $100. That night, 2 men from the homicide squad came to the hotel and inquired of Lane's film crew why they were so interested in Benavides. Quote, "Why did you offer our boy $100 for?" According to the film crew, the policeman knew the exact time of Benavides' appointment with Lane, implied Benavides would not be there, and generally showed a great deal of more concern about their footage on the Tippit murder than about the killing of Kennedy. And Benavides never did show up to the Mark Lane interview. Akilah Clemens, she's the one that described the slayer as short, stocky, and said he fled with a tall, lanky man wearing khaki trousers, neither of whom resembled Oswald, has been repeatedly threatened. According to Mark Lane, she was visited a few days after the event by a gun-toting man. "He just told me it'd be best if I didn't say anything because I might get hurt." She said several policemen came to see her after that, and one expressed hope that she would not be killed on the way to work. So, yeah. Then we have the curious story of Harold Williams, who was working as a chef at the Mikado, a Dallas bottle club, when it was raided in early November of 1963. Now, one of the arresting officers, he said, was JD Tippit, and seated next to him in the cop car, so close you'd think they were lovers, was none other than ride-along Jack Ruby. Williams told attorney Mark Lane he knew Ruby. He used to furnish us with girls. And he stated he got a good long look at Tippit on the ride to the police station. But Harold Williams did not follow the example of 6 of the other 6 known witnesses to a Ruby Tippit association. He continued to shoot off his mouth about it. Williams said the police talked to him in December of '63 and advised him that he had not seen Ruby with Tippit. Strongly advised him. Interesting. Then I came across an interesting document from August 24th, 1977, from the United States Department of Justice, Federal Bureau of Investigation. On August 24th, 1977, Lieutenant James Hobbs from the Intelligence Division of Dallas, Texas Police Department furnished a copy of the attached intelligence report dated August 10th, 1977 to Special Agent Udo Specht, FBI, Dallas, Texas. Lieutenant Hobbs authorized the dissemination of the report as well as the information he is furnishing to the U.S. Department of Justice or to any other appropriate investigative agency. Lieutenant Hobbs advised that the information contained in the intelligence report concerning Max Allen Long came from a police department source who he did not identify. Lieutenant Hobbs advised that the source also stated that Long told the source that Lee Harvey Oswald was on his way to exactly 324 East 10th Street after the assassination of President Kennedy, but didn't quite make it. Long told the source that 324 East 10th Street was supposed to have been a safe house for Oswald to go to. Long advised the source that by letting Oswald come to this house located at 324 East 10th Street, Dallas, Texas, this was supposed to wipe out a unspecific debt that Long had with some people in New Orleans. Lieutenant Hobbs pointed out that the Dallas police officer JD Tippit was killed in the 400 block of East 10th Street. Hobbs advised that he has reviewed the Dallas Police Department offense report concerning the officer Tippit killing, and the offense report reflects this document contains neither recommendations nor conclusions. It is the property of the FBI and blah, 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 blah. So what does that document say? Let's see. All right. Dallas Police Department Intelligence Division Intelligence Report. Subject Max Allen Long. Date of birth 1/25/19. Subject has a criminal arrest record that dates back to 1945. Subject lives at 324 East 10th Street with his mother, Mrs. Bessie Long. Source stated that at one time Long was a rated boxer, and after his fighting career he operated a motel bar type of business in New Orleans. Source stated Long appeared to have a great deal of money during this time, but has fallen on hard times due to marital problems since. Source stated that he has known Long for a long period of time. Source stated he is fairly close to Long, and Long has confided in him on several occasions. Source stated he was at Long's house and they were drinking one night. Source stated Long was intoxicated but not extremely drunk. Source stated they began talking about the assassination of President Kennedy, and that Long related the following story to him. Source stated Long told him the club he operated in New Orleans was backed was financially backed by Clay Shaw. Shaw was a central figure in the Jim Garrison probe in New Orleans. Long also told the source that he knew Lee Harvey Oswald, and that Oswald spent several nights in an apartment or hotel room over where Long was living in New Orleans before the assassination. Source stated Long showed him several photographs. Source stated one of the photographs was a picture of three men, he identified the three men in the picture as being Clay Shaw, Long, and David Ferry. Source stated another photograph was a picture of Long and two persons who Long identified as being Jack Ruby and Lee Harvey Oswald. Source stated a third photograph was a picture of Long and two persons identified by Long as being Clay Shaw and Lee Harvey Oswald. Source stated Long keeps the pictures in a cardboard beer box in the living room. Source stated he knew Jack Ruby and was able to identify him, but he was not sure on the identification of Clay Shaw, David Ferry, and Lee Harvey Oswald. Source stated the pictures are black and white and are of poor quality. Source stated Long told him that the FBI had harassed him on numerous occasions when he was in New Orleans, and at one time they had taken several photographs away from him. Source stated Long told him he had refused to tell the FBI anything of importance, 'cause he ain't no snitch. That's right. So what does all this mean? Does it get us any closer to figuring out the Tippit murder? Not really. One thing I'm fairly certain of is that it was not Lee Harvey Oswald. I preclude him just on time alone, the time it would have taken him to get there. I don't think he could have got there in time to kill JD Tippit. You know, this whole time has been pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. Several of the witnesses stated it was 106 or 110, 112. I think Helen Markham's bus came at 1:15. She would have been gone by then. And it wasn't immediate. They pretty much immediately came after they were called, but there was a situation where, the original person who tried to help JD Tippit couldn't work the radio, and somebody else had to come over and radio it in. Then they had to call the funeral home. Then they came, and I think tying down the original correct time of the Tippit shooting could help exonerate Oswald as being the killer for sure. Don't really know what Oswald was up to that day, or what he was doing, or where he was going, or why, or how he ended up at the Texas Theater, or how they knew he was going to be there. But when you start taking a look at all these witness deaths and allegations of people that knew that JD Tippit and Ruby knew each other, that Ruby had done ride-alongs with JD Tippit in the past, how tight Ruby was with the police officers and the special treatment that they got in his establishments, from alcohol to women. Jack Ruby was supplying girls for parties, and it just gets crazier and crazier. But hopefully it gives you guys something to think about, something a little different. And, more to look into for sure. Anyway, folks, that's it for this one. This is your boy. Peace.